also in the vein of hiring and onboarding and recruiting, we have a client that is trying to decide if drug testing and performing a background check is going to be a part of their hiring process. And so the question that they posed, I believe some of this was to you. When might a company want to do these and when not? So I think that this is both a legal question and a company culture question. So happy to give some examples of some fun examples here. But Summer, what are your thoughts?
Yes, well, this is definitely going to be a fun topic to dive into. For those of you that are regular listeners, you know that we work with small businesses all across the US at various stages of their business growth. But it's not uncommon that we're working with these businesses in developing some of these key processes that are likely going to stick with them as they grow. And this is one that I'm in regular conversations with business owners about as they're starting to hire. Starting to ask, will you conduct drug testing? Will you conduct background checks? And it's interesting the different opinions that exist out there. And certainly, my role is to help provide some of that information on the compliance front and kind of share the pros and cons to help these companies make the decisions. But it's really interesting to me, Joey, that sometimes when there's already a couple individuals on the leadership team and they have differing opinions, just kind of sitting back and hearing like what they see are the pros and the cons. So, wanted to chat just a little bit about, kind of what some of those considerations are and, just kind of get our listeners thinking about it if this is maybe a decision that's been on their horizon as well.
Yeah, so let me start this with a fun one that Maria on our team was actually a part of. We had a client that was actually in the alcohol space. So they produce a component that ultimately goes into beverages and cocktails. And great guy to work with, who was the owner of the company. Great and successful business that they were running, and his position was that he did not want to do drug tests because he felt that um, it was counterintuitive to the culture that he wanted to create at his company, where it wasn't, hey, let's do all the drugs, but it was like, hey, work gets tough. We understand people, you know, smoke or whatever the case may be. And I think this was more so around marijuana, which is a whole episode in and of itself. Um, but what we did was we said, okay, hey, all right, you don't want to do the drug testing. That's cool. Let's craft a policy around performance and not letting anything impair your performance, not let anything impair your safety and judgment. And so that was a way that we created sort of a culture of freedom, but also a culture of boundaries around safety and judgment and performance and communication and interacting with colleagues and vendors and customers. So I think that worked. I know it worked for them. And that's just one story. And I share that story to start just to say that, like, there's more than one way to get to the goal that you have. And that was just a fun one that we got to do along the way.
Well, you definitely mentioned one of the key factors in the conversation that needs to be had when you are trying to determine if drug testing or background checks, like a kind of lump them all in together, because I think some of the same considerations apply. Now, of course, this is under the kind of operating assumption that you're not in an industry or that this specific role is like legally required to have these types of tests performed. So, I think some of the other considerations, you mentioned company culture. I mentioned the industry and the state, but I think companies really need to ask themselves, like, well, what is the purpose of doing it? And primarily, it's risk mitigation, right? So companies perform these tests and or background checks to try to determine if the individual that they are hiring has a higher risk to the company. And some of the questions that I ask leaders when they're on the fence about this are questions like this. I ask them if they opted not to perform background checks and they were hiring, say, somebody who was a CFO and they were going to be responsible for all the financial matters in their business, would they be comfortable not knowing if that individual potentially had legal problems in regards to theft of large sums of money or embezzlement or items along those lines? Like, wouldn't you want to know before giving somebody that large responsibility to your organization?
Yeah, I've got another fun story, not of a client, but Summer, you know the deal where your friends know you're in HR, so they bring all of their weird and crazy stories to you. A friend of mine was working in a retail management in retail, and mentioned how the organization hired a store manager but didn't do their due diligence. And then these days, you could just take a name, Google it, see what comes up. And so some of the employees were restless about, why is this person so erratic? Why does it not seem like they know what they're doing? So on and so forth. And so they did some Google searching and found that, the store manager was previously a party in a lawsuit for bad business practices at another establishment. And so uh, that got handled, but how risky and dangerous is that to have someone on your team and you have no idea what their past is and how it might tie into your present? I'll say that, but then I'll also caveat that to say too that there are rules and laws in certain states about asking about criminal history. And then criminal history, you can only ask in some states once an offer has been presented. And so it's called, ban the box. But you have to be mindful how and when you set up that background check, and you have to be mindful of how and when you set up that drug test.
Yes, and I feel like this topic could be several episodes in itself, but I wanted to ensure that, if other companies are at this point where they're trying to make decisions as to whether they do or don't, that we at least give them a little bit to think about in terms of whether they may want to or may not want to. What I'm seeing is that on the drug testing side, I do see companies that don't have it as a requirement starting to loosen up a little bit on it if they feel like they have a lower risk in terms of the type of workers that they're hiring and the industry that they're working in. Where drug testing can actually be beneficial is if you work in an industry where individuals have a higher probability of, say, getting injured and it turning into a workers' comp claim. I mean, certainly having the ability to do post accident testing or reasonable suspicion testing is beneficial to an employer. But when we talk about those background checks, and the same applies for drug testing, there are so many various state laws, so many different requirements, so many different notices and steps that vary state to state, that if you are not totally solid on ensuring that your company's following these processes to a T, there is a lot of risk just there in itself. So I recommend that if you're a small business and you're working through these items, that you ensure that you have a professional jumpstart. It's one of the services that we provide on quite a regular basis. But it's not something that you just want to go out to a website, kind of copy and paste your policy and expect that it's going to meet all of your needs.